Okay, ooh, that sounds a little on the loud side. There we go.
Okay, I will take the jacket. Well, we still have another minute, right?
Just one.
Just 1 minute?
That one there is about a minute slow. That one shows two.
I didn't dress appropriately.
Is there a
You know,
is there a dress code?
no, I usually wear like the Thrivalist shirt for the Thrivalist classes. So much for that today.
But it's got long sleeves for the cool temperatures.
I did. I dressed appropriately for the weather. You are so right. Come on in. You ready, Carl? Oh, okay. Ready or not? Oh, if I don't unconnect this, ready? Hi, guys.
Hey.
Oh, my friends. Hello, Thrivalist Online. Anyways, welcome. And today, by popular demand, is Daryl Bouchard. And we are so glad to have him come talk today. He only gave me a brief thing to say about him. He grew up in Central Utah learning about natural health and healing clays. And I will have him actually tell you more about himself. And we're so excited to have him back. So everybody, welcome Daryl.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here. Yeah, so my name is Daryl. I've done a class here before on salt. And, if in a survival situation, salt and clay are actually two things that you really can't live without. In fact, as we talked in the salt class, if you didn't have a refrigerator, everything that you would eat would have to be preserved with salt. So kimchi, sauerkrauts, and foods. And so salt has always been a staple in times of stress and in times of survival. Because your animals need salt, you need salt, and so it actually can become a very good source of trade in a situation where that would become an issue. And as great as salt is, if Marcelo said, hey, Daryl, you're too lucky, you can't have access to salt and clay, you've got to pick one. I would actually pick clay because there's other great sources of salt out there. There's a lot of great salts from around the world. But clay is something that's very unique. And now, the clay that we're talking about tonight is a very specific type of clay. There's 7 different classes of clay, and you've got clays that are great for pottery, some that are great for bricks. You have a specific class of clay called a cementite clay. And that's the type of clay we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm not just suggesting any old clay anywhere. It's a very specific type of clay. And I call the presentation Natural Solution or Ancient Solutions for Modern Ailments. And if you ever think about an elephant in the jungle, if an elephant gets hurt, an elephant doesn't run to the mud or doesn't run to the vet. Elephants don't typically do that, but they run to the mud and they roll in the mud, and the mud dries and draws and pulls things out. And if you've ever watched late night television and watched a science program called Nova, you will have seen these birds, these macaws in South America that eat toxic berries. Then they fly over and eat clay. Then they fly back over and eat more toxic berries, and they go back and eat clay. And in many cultures, clay is actually given at every meal, and we're going to talk about why that is. So, how did humans and how did we as a population and survivalists start talking about clay? Well, there was a French homeopath, his name was Raymond Dextreet, and he wrote a book or a series of lectures and essays on healing. These were compiled years later into a book called Our Earth, Our Cure. It's out of print. You can't find it. Occasionally you might come across a copy on eBay. That book, Our Earth, Our Cure, is known as kind of the grandfather of clay books. And this book talks about all of these ways you can use clay, which seems crazy because He just says you should eat it and you should put it on your body and do all of these weird things. And so when the book first was translated into English back in the 70s, a lot of people in the health food market thought this guy is a nut job. We know health food, but you don't eat clay. And sure enough, over the last 30, 40 years, people have used clay more and more. And it turns out the French guy that wrote the book wasn't as crazy as we thought he was. So now there's a lot of books on clay, and you can go to Amazon or you can go to a health store and you can find a lot of different books on clay. This book called The Healing Power of Clay, and the book called Earth Cures, and the book called The Healing Clay, those three books are actually sections of the original book on clay called Our Earth, Our Cure. And then these other books have all come out since then, and most of those will go back and reference that first book on clay. So animals, just like people would use animals to find salt. In fact, if you're in a survival situation and you don't have water, if you have an animal that you can pen up and basically starve them of water, they'll get super thirsty. When you let the animal go, they'll go find water. You follow the animal, and that's how you find water. They did the same thing with salt. If you deprive an animal of salt and you're a human, you're trying to find the salt deposits, deprive an animal, catch a monkey, something, keep them away from any salt. As soon as you let them loose, you follow them, and they'll find water and salt because it's just so essential. And clay is the same way. So animals have eaten clay and use clay since the dawn of time. If you use that elephant example, elephants run to the mud and it draws and it pulls that. Now Cleopatra, and every diva since Cleopatra noticed that, and so you can walk into any spa in the world and they'll do a clay facial. The reason they do a clay facial is when clay dries, it draws and pulls out thorns and impurities, which is why you do that on your face, to lift out the impurities and the blackheads and the dirt, oily stuff in your skin, which is why you get a facial. Clay also as a facial, not only is it pulling and drying, it actually increases local circulation, which is why your face is red after a facial, because it actually draws blood to the surface. And so that's why every spa in the world uses clay. And just like animals have used clay, and some of our ancestors, in fact, grandma, if you ever got stung by a bee, might have said, hey, go put some mud on it. And it's that right kind of mud. It's not just any mud. That right kind of mud, as it dries, it'll pull out and draw that out, just like it would a thorn or a thistle or a blackhead on your nose. And that's why we have poultices, because it's pulling, and clay is the primary poultice ever used. So birds, I mentioned the African parrots and the South American parrots, they actually eat clay as part of their daily diet because it neutralizes the chemicals in the husks of some of the food that they eat. Reptiles eat clay, butterflies, invertebrates, all of these, everything that we know of that's on the planet, including people, will eat and use clay because it's been such an important part of civilization. If you go back to the earliest recordings in history in Africa, clay is used internally and externally. If you go to Mesopotamia, same thing. You hear stories in a lot of the early religious texts about taking clay and adding saliva and putting it on, and it heals eyes, and it does a lot of amazing things. And it's not just in religious texts, it's actually in a lot of medical texts as well. The Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, and of course Israel have all used clay for healing. In fact, in the times of Rome, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, all of the armies would take clay with them, for not only for dysentery, but also for wound care. And I'll show you a couple of examples here. In Germany, this type of clay is called Hilerde, which is healing earth. If you go to Russia, it's called, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that one, but it's healing sea mud. If you go to Americas, the earliest reference I've ever found in the Americas comes from 1588. It's a guy named Thomas Harriot who said it's been found by some of our physicians and surgeons to be the same kind and virtue and even more effective than the clay they were getting in Europe. The inhabitants use it very much to cure sores and wounds, and that's the clay here they found in the U.S. in 1500. Because clay has always been used. And the interesting thing is, even in the 1500s, he's referencing this other clay that they're also using for sores and wounds. Times of Rome, they actually made clay tablets as medicine, and they would put the emperor's stamp on the clay tablet, and they would take him into battle with them because of the way it works for dysentery. So Thomas Harriot, that was referencing this clay from Europe, he was actually talking about this particular clay, also referenced by an army physician in 70 AD. So again, this is old medicine. It says this Lemanian earth comes from a cave-like hollow in the island of Lemos. It's very useful against deadly poisons. It's the same remedies. It's a good remedy against bites and stings of poisonous animals. Some use it for cleansing rituals, and it's very useful against dysentery. In 70 AD, they knew clay and they knew how to use clay, and then somehow we forgot about using clay, and we got all like fancy and forgot about what was just here on the earth. So what is a healing clay? I mentioned before, I'm not talking about any type of, or just general clay. There's different types of clay. The particular type is called a cementite clay, and there's two names you'll hear as you're looking for cementite clay. One of those is montmorillonite. If you read Raymond Dextreet's book, or a lot of the books I referenced earlier, they'll talk about bentonite clay, or they'll talk about montmorillonite clay. That's kind of confusing, and for years it was confusing, and the reason for that is because there was a guy that was in Fort Benton, Wyoming, and he comes across an outcropping of clay and says, oh my golly, this is brand new stuff, I ought to name it something. I'm here by Fort Benton, Wyoming, I'm going to name this type of clay bentonite. And so that type of clay became known as bentonite. He didn't know that hundreds of years before there was a guy in Montmorillon in France. And the guy in France was walking along and came across this outcropping of clay and said, my golly, this is a new thing. I ought to name it something. I'm going to name it montmorillonite. And so a lot of the early books, if they were European, would mention it as montmorillonite. If you were in the US, you'd name this particular mineral bentonite. It's the same mineral. And so that's why you'll get these two names almost used interchangeably in a lot of those books based on the location. Now the challenge with clay is this type of clay is weathered volcanic ash. So you have a lot of different types of clay. This particular type of clay is weathered volcanic ash. And so if you have a volcano that's Mount Vesuvius or Mount St. Helens or Fish Lake or Yellowstone, and this volcano erupts, based on where that volcano erupts, you're going to have different mineral compositions from the volcano based on where that volcano is located. And then as that volcanic ash weathers over the next thousands of years, it's going to weather differently. And that's really the big challenge with clay. I'm going to show you a study that NASA did on clay. In fact, in the 1960s, NASA took clay with them to space for osteoporosis and bone density challenges. And when they did that study on the clay for NASA, they had a real tough time because the clay is so varied, and they were hoping to find like an apple, and they would just make sure it's the same apple everywhere. But even within a deposit of clay, because of the variation in the mineral composition, the pH, the cation exchange capacity, all of those clays test differently. And so they tested this whole big field of clay, and they found that this particular little spot worked better than this particular spot. And even in this particular spot, they could grab 2 handfuls and they would test differently, which is one of the reasons why the science behind clay is so hard. And we can try to blame the lack of science, the lack of medical science on clay because of the medical industry. And I think there's probably some truth to that because it's just dirt off the ground, it's cheap, you can't really trademark it. But it's also really hard to study because of the variation within the product itself. There's also kaolin clay. It's another really good healing clay. I don't know as much about that because I've spent most of my time researching the bentonite side, but you'll hear that term as well as kaolin. In fact, if you've ever, some of you older folks, if you ever heard the term or used the product kaopectate, that was kaolin clay and a pectin. Those were the only 2 ingredients in kaopectate. Your grandmothers and probably some of you knew how well that worked, and that's why, and they changed the formula and they actually got rid of it because it was just kaolin clay and pectin. It was a little too basic. So I'm going to talk about external uses of clay and internal uses of clay. Why it works internally, we don't know everything about it, but we do know a couple of things. So the first one thing that a lot of people will use clay for is for acid issues. Like you might reach over and grab a Tums or a Rolaids. If you've ever noticed that tastes like clay or like chalk, There's a reason for that because that's basically what that is in a Tums. So clay can be used for any acidy issues because it has a high pH. The clay, the right kind of healing clays will have a pH of about 8.7 to 9.8. And so if you have an acidity issue, that can help settle that off. Again, which is why Tums and Rolaids are also alkaline just like that. The second thing is clay has a high cation exchange capacity. If you remember, we have cations and we have anions in chemistry, and one is positive and one's negative. And so clay, interestingly enough, has a very high cation exchange capacity, which means it has a high ability to bind positively charged particles to it. So one of the main uses of clay internally for animals is actually for heavy metal detox, because if we were to spill a mercury thermometer in here, and we're exposed to Hg3, which is positively charged mercury, then we would go to a clinic and they would do something called chelation therapy, which is when they'll take an IV and run a chelator through our system, and a chelator binds those positively charged metals so we can flush them out of the system. In fact, if you go to a bird of prey sanctuary here in the West, it's a bigger problem. I was probably part of that problem because as a kid I'd go hunt rabbits and I would use lead shot. And if you go hunt rabbits, which I did, and if you shoot that rabbit with lead shotgun shell and you don't take that rabbit and keep it out of circulation, eventually a bird of prey is going to come and probably eat that rabbit. Which is why now when you're hunting birds, they tell you to use steel shot. Because if you shoot that rabbit, it's got lead shot in it, and an eagle comes and eats that, or a California condor comes and eats that, now they've got lead poisoning. And a lot of these bird sanctuaries, the birds in those sanctuaries have lead toxicity. So what do you think they do to help remove that lead toxicity? They feed them clay, because clay will remove the lead, the cadmium, and the mercury from those birds of prey. And so they'll take clay here from Utah, they bind it into the food that they feed the birds, and the birds then are able to get rid of that heavy metal toxicity through chelation, through the cation exchange capacity. Clay also has a very large surface area to surface tension ratio. I used to run with the EMTs. One of the things that you do as an EMT for drug overdoses is you can have somebody ingest activated charcoal. The reason you would do that on a drug overdose is because activated charcoal has a large surface area to surface tension ratio, meaning if you consume the activated charcoal at the near proximity of taking a pharmaceutical, the activated charcoal will actually bind to the pharmaceutical, and so it'll pull it out of the system. And so clay is also very high cation exchange capacity and a large surface area. So these are just some of the reasons that French guy, if you wrote that or bought that book, The Healing Power of Clay, or the Our Earth, Our Cure, or some of those new clays books, you will see all kinds of things that are listed. Of all of those, the ones that are reoccurring more and more are stomach issues and dysentery. That's where most people use clay internally most of the time. So here is, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this. I'm going to step to the side just so I'm not in front of it. So interestingly enough, this is NASA. So NASA this is a clay study, the physiological effects of dietary clay supplementation in the 1960s for NASA. Now in NASA, when we're in the space program, if I'm here on Earth, I have weight pushing on me every day. So I have weight training just walking across the floor. If I was in space, I don't have that. And so one of the big problems in the space program is bone density and calcium absorption, because you don't have that daily weight training that helps build strong bones. And so NASA said, what supplements can we take to space with us to increase bone density and calcium absorption? And they said, well, we know that there is calcium in clay. I wonder if we could use that as a supplement. So what they found was that the findings indicated that clay supplementation at these different layers caused a highly significant increment in the body weight and prevented the occurrence of pathological changes which were observed in the long bones of rats, mice, and hamsters. And it was more than its calcium content. This is the important part. The beneficial effects of clay supplementation when fed with purified diet and other rations were primarily due to it serving its source of dietary calcium, although evidence was obtained that the clay supplementation contained some factor or factors other than calcium which promoted improved calcium absorption and bone density. What they found was is they looked at the amount of calcium in the clay and they said, okay, if you're eating this much calcium in clay, we would expect your bone density to look like this because you're not going to get 100%. What they found was is when they took the clay, they got all of this plus this. And so that's why NASA took clay to space with them, because of the way it impacted bone density and calcium absorption. The FDA did a study later on clay. This is the evaluation of health aspects of bentonite clay and kaolin clay as food ingredients. And what they found was that very little, if any, bentonite is absorbed after oral administration, and as much as 3% in the diet has no observable effects on experimental animals. However, diets containing 10 to 25% can cause growth retardation because of the dilution in the diet. Now, nobody in their right mind is going to eat 3% of their diet in clay, let alone 10 to 25%. But that just shows that even that, or even the FDA acknowledges that very little, if any, clay is absorbed. Now, the fun thing, I'm not going to go through all of these studies, and I can give copies to Marcel and you can dig into them. This is just says the same thing. When eating clay, no significant differences were shown in the liver, the kidney functions, electrolytes, or the vitamins. One of the concerns with clay is if clay will bind to a pharmaceutical, will it bind to the other nutrients in the diet? This study says no, it does not do that. Again, this is children taking clay, doses a gram and a half per day for 2 weeks, and found no significant decrease in any of the bioavailability of the food that they're consuming. And this is, I think, the cool part. So they did this study. This is in the American Journal of Medicine, published, and bentonite, that's interesting wording. Bentonite was considered as a treatment for diarrhea. At 1961, it was shown that orally administered bentonite treats 97% of cases with different cause factors of diarrhea. 97%. Now, you can't find any drug on the market that works 97% of the time, and yet in this case, for 97% of cases for all causes of diarrhea, which includes viruses, infections, food allergies, colitis, mucus colitis, and food poisoning, clay was working 97% of the time. So moving on, now this is alleviating dietary cadmium oxidative damage in carp. This is showing that dietary cadmium exposure can result in oxidative damage, and obviously that's not a question there. And MT, that's montmorillonite clay supplementation in the diet, could protect carp from dietary cadmium-induced damage through the liver and the kidneys. So the clay pulls that out. This is the same thing, but for lead in pigs. Supplementation of the clay in the diet was found to significantly reduce lead concentrations of tissues in blood, the brain, the liver, the bone, the kidneys, and the hair. So we don't sell it that way, or companies don't sell it for humans, but in every animal husbandry case, they use clay to remove cadmium, lead, and mercury damage from the brain, the blood, the bone, the kidney, and the hair. This is on tilapia as well. This is for, again, lead. The result shows that the clay supplementation reduced the lead accumulation in the kidney and the blood of the tilapia. So clay internally works amazing. And so I always say never have kids or grandkids on the property without having some clay, and especially if you don't have access to Western medicine. If there was a situation where you were on your own for a while, and you can't go and you grab all of this stuff for your kid's stomach aches or for dysentery or for diarrhea or all of those things you might go to the drugstore for, by having clay that lasts forever and is really cheap, even if you end up using that until you can get help from Western medicine, it's been used since the dawn of time. So now what about topical? Well, I mentioned before that our ancestors used clay internally, but they also used clay topically. And I would say probably even more topical use than internal use. And This is why. So clay absorbs bacteria and debris. So when you put clay on your face at the spa, it draws and it pulls out those little bacteria on your nose and cleans out the blackheads and cleans out the pores. It greases circulation. It absorbs tissue fluid. It creates a protective barrier. It's anti-inflammatory. It increases local blood circulation. It's a primary blood stopper, and it's a key component in wound healing. And I'm going to show you again just a few studies on clay topically, and I can give all of these studies if somebody wants to really dig into it. But this is one of my favorite ones because I've had kids, and some of you have probably had kids, and maybe you have grandkids. And diaper rash is something that is usually a problem. Now, when you think of diaper rash, you think of acidic stool and baby's bottom. And so what you typically do is you use either ointments or creams and try to cool that off. Usually those are alkaline to help set off that acidity, and clay by itself does all of those things. Not only that, but check this out. So 90% of infants in the bentonite group were improved completely in the first 3 days. So only 37% in the other group were improved, but 90% of infants were improved in just 3 days of using clay for diaper rash. And you can imagine, you know, baby, this hot, sore diaper rash, and you've got a lot of other choices you could choose, but in 90% of the cases in 3 days, clay will solve that problem. Findings present studies showed the onset of the improvement in the first 6 hours was significantly higher. So completely done in 90% in 3 days, but in 6 hours, significant higher. Also, the improvement in the first 3 days was significantly higher in the bentonite group, and just on and on. And with clay, you can use it 2 ways topically for diaper rash. You can put on just powder. You can buy some powdered bentonite clay, put it in a sifter bottle or a pepper shaker, if that's all you've got, and you can use it just as a powder sifter. And the clay is a powder. It neutralizes stomach acid. It draws moisture away from baby's bottom, which is great on both accounts. And then the other factor is actually you can use the hydrated wet gel clay, just like you'd use on your face. You can do the same thing. So if baby's really sore, maybe it got away from somebody because there was a lot of stuff going on, and now it's like sore, red, blistered diaper rash, putting that wet clay mud right on baby's bottom, the mud itself feels really good, and then the mud will actually pull and draw that heat out just like you would on a burn. And then in the interim, you can just use the baby powder like you would at any regular diaper change. To me, I smile because this is something that our ancestors would have had. It's basically dirt off the ground. It's super cheap. There's none of this fun, you know, all the crazy stuff added to it. And yet in 90% of cases in 3 days, it's gone. And in the first 6 hours, substantially improved versus all of the other ointments and treatments that, you know, we can go and spend a lot of money to do. This is on collagen fibers. So we know collagen is really important in the skin when you're healing. And after 7 days of clay treatment, there's an increase in collagen fibers was observed more than that in the control group. 50-1 in the difference here. So 50 times more when you've got clay present, which is just crazy. That clay applications increase collagen fibers so much. Because of that, they use this on a skin graft program to help use as a lattice. Actually, there we go, right there. So in this study, they used clay as the membrane or like the lattice to have skin regrow because of how quickly it increases the collagen fibers. And so using electron microscope, they revealed that the scaffolds obtained were highly porous and suitable for implementation when they were using clay in that skin graft procedure because of how healing it is to the skin. So in early treatments, if you go back to the Persians, the Romans, the Greeks, all of those empires used clay. The earliest recordings we have talk about the clay may not only soothe pain, but increased healing. The results have been a number of effective topical treatments. He undertook a voyage to the island of Limos. That's that island that was mentioned in the 1500s and in 70 AD to figure out what they were using and what made that clay special. Earliest as 2000 BC, they found writings of using clay to heal internally and externally. So there was a researcher, her name was Dr. Linda Williams, right here on the end. She was from University of Arizona. I've met her. She's a lovely woman, and she was shamed into doing some clay studies. And she was a researcher in actually the oil, gas, and mining industry. And there was a group out of Africa that was using clay to treat a flesh-eating bacteria and leprosy type problem in Africa. And they were trying to get a U.S.-backed institution to do some studies on this clay so they could take it and use it more universally, this nonprofit was. And whenever this nonprofit came to Harvard, Yale, all of the big medical schools, University of Pennsylvania, all of them basically just said, there's no way we're going to study clay for wound treatment. You guys are nuts. And so eventually they contacted Dr. Williams, and she said the same thing. I'm not spending my research time to study clay to put dirt in people's cuts. And they wrote a scathing letter and just ripped her up one side and down the other. And she was so offended that she wrote them back and said, okay, I'll show you. I'm going to do this study, and I'm going to prove all of you guys are just nut jobs. And she started doing the study, and then her whole career shifted. And this is why. So this is using clay for antibacterial, antibacterial resistant bacteria. And what they found was using these nanomaterials, which is the clay, geological, to heal skin infections has been evident since the dawn of time. She observed that the bacteria was effective against E. coli, all of these different E. coli's, including the MRSA-resistant bacteria, or MRSA that are antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So she started publishing all of these things, unearthing the antimicrobial mechanisms of medicinal clay to combat antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. Although clay has been used for medical purposes throughout the millennia, they have remained largely unstudied, and that's why she got into this. Documented use of these clay to stop commonly known flesh-eating bacteria led to our research on the geothermal or geochemical properties of antibacterial minerals. And that's what they found, was that clay is actually antibacterial. And there's two ways it's antibacterial. When I talked to Dr. Linda Williams, she said there's two things that they found. There's one type of clay, which isn't the bentonite clay from here in Utah. There's one type of clay that actually works as strong as bleach. It's a blue clay from Wyoming, and it is so antibacterial, it is just like bleach. It kills bacteria. It's kind of painful, it stings. And what they would do, when the locals would use this clay, they would use that stinging clay first, then they'd follow up with the gentle clay. The clay that's bentonite, the typical healing bentonite clay, is not antibacterial like bleach. It's antibacterial in that it has a high affinity for bacteria, meaning when the clay binds to the bacteria, it suffocates it and doesn't let it proliferate. So it does kill the bacteria because it suffocates it. It doesn't kill it like bleach does through oxidization. So when you talk about clay, one of the other reasons, in addition to the antibacterial properties of clay, it's the ideal homeostatic agent. Now, I'm going to show some pictures here that do have blood. So there's some more pictures and some other things. So if anybody is queasy when they see a picture with a little bit of blood or a lot of bit of blood, you might want to look down first and then glance and not pass out on me. But clay is the ideal homeostatic agent. In fact, if you go to Afghanistan, if you went to South America, if you went to the police department over in West Valley or here in West Valley, and somebody gets their leg shot or blown off, they're going to use a product called Cool Clot or Quick Clot to stop that. They've got every police car, every ambulance has it in there because the way it stops. And guess what it's made of? If you said clay, you're right. Because clay is the ideal homeostatic agent. It's able to stop hemorrhaging from large arteries within veins within 2 minutes of application. It's capable of effectively using through pools of blood. Some things you've got to try to get all that coagulated stuff out first before you can use some of the other procedures. With clay, you don't have to worry about that. You just throw the clay on, it works just fine. The nice thing about clay is you don't have to be trained on it. That's why Cool Clot and Quick Clot are such great products, because you don't have to have any medical training other than to take the lid off and put it on, and it works really well. It's lightweight, it's durable, it doesn't spoil, it doesn't go bad. There's not an expiration date on it, so you can just throw it in your get-out bag or your 72-hour kit, and if you need it, it's always there. And if you don't need it, then it's there for your posterity 100 years from now because it doesn't ever change. And it's super inexpensive. So compared to some of the other ways you can spend money on first aid, it's a great option. So now here are some I said some bloody pictures. So now this is using Cool Clot in trauma hemorrhaging control cases. So a quick clot is clay. It's actually, I'll show you the formula here in just a second. It's a zeolite that works by absorbing water and concentrating coagulation factors to stop bleeding in a series of patients. There were 83 cases involving applications to external wounds and 20 cases of intracorporeal use by military and civilian surgeons. Applications by first responders were successful in controlling hemorrhaging in 92% of cases. And again, it's just clay. Now, the fun part here is the key ingredient in this new gauze is this kaolin clay, which often used to make pottery. Happens to be rich in aluminosilicate nanomaterials, which is what bentonite is as well. But then we get to this study. Obtained shows that the mixture of bentonite and zeolite minerals dramatically reduced the volume of blood loss and bleeding and the clotting time. Bentonite has a wide variety of pharmaceutical applications. According to the FDA, there's no evidence in the available information on bentonite that demonstrates or suggests reasonable grounds to suspect a hazard to the public when it's used in the manner now practiced, which again just says clay's safe. It's just dirt. It's just dirt. Now this is kind of the fun part. So this is, they took some patients, they actually take an artery and they'll cut it. Usually they'll do this with a bovine or different animals. But what they find here is the clotting time in the samples of the control group in comparison with samples treated by bentonite alone, zeolite alone, and Cool Clot, which is a mixture of the two that's trademarked and sold. And so the control group is 235 seconds. So assuming you're a healthy individual and you've got clotting factors, you cut open and the bleed time is going to be 235 seconds. When you put bentonite on it, it cuts it from 235 to 149. So maybe not quite half, but a substantial decrease in the bleed time by putting bentonite on it. If you put zeolite on it, it decreases it. Not as good as the bentonite, but it does work. And if you mix bentonite and zeolite together, then you actually get a little bit of a bump beyond just bentonite by itself. But that's why it's used and has been used by every military since 2500 BC when we started first hearing that. So I'm going to kind of finish this presentation with a little bit on how to use it. Well, fortunately, if you read the Raymond Dextreet's book, The Our Earth, Our Cure, or some of the newer books out there, actually my dad even has a book that is here in the bookstore portion of the store called We Eat Clay and Wear It Too. All of those talk about how to mix clay. Generally, it's 2 parts water to 1 part clay, and that'll give you the consistency that you see about here, which is about like a really thick mayonnaise or a really thick ketchup. If you're doing a facial at the spa, sometimes they'll do it a little thinner, more like a thin mustard. At my house, I always have a mason jar, just a mason jar like this, mixed up, ready to go. And I like to have it about that consistency because I can use it for facials, I can use it for burns, mosquito bites, bee stings. I can use it for a lot of ways when it's mixed up like that. The biggest mistake people make is they'll get a jar of clay or a bucket of clay, and it's just in a powder form. And then you're going to burn yourself or you're going to get a cut or whatever you're going to use it for. And then you come and now you've got to, with your sore finger, try to mix the clay up, and it takes about 4 hours for it to really swell. So it's always nice to have it pre-mixed, ready to go. Whether you mix it up in a mason jar or you use one of those little these little plastic tubes back there. I used to keep bees, and I always had one of those under the seat of my truck just full of clay. And because I could just pull that out, and it was always, if you put about this much clay powder in the bottom and then you put about twice that much water on top, shake it up, let it sit, then you can add a little bit more water to it. But generally you're 2 parts water to 1 part clay. And then it never goes bad. You can add some more water, you can add some more clay, but it just doesn't go bad. So hydrated clay, that's what I just talked about there. This is an example here of me putting it on my forearm. And I just have a jar, it's pre-mixed. I grab a spatula, a rubber scraper, scoop it out of the jar and put it right on. The clay is, because of that high cation exchange capacity, it has a lot of electric charge, which means if you were to put mix it up in a mason jar and you put your normal canning jar lid on top, it's going to start reacting with that metal like that. And even within a few hours, you come back and look at the lid and your lid will be rusted because it's that electrical. That clay is so electrically charged. So if you're going to mix it in a mason jar, I always use a plastic lid. Or you could put a piece of saran wrap down or something and then use a regular canning jar lid. But canning or a plastic lid for me is always easier. And then you can cover it a lot of different ways. So I just covered it, if I'm going to work, in this case, I actually got stung by a bee. But if I'm going to work, I don't want to have this messy clay falling all over. So a piece of saran wrap, or you could use a cloth diaper or cheesecloth, you can wrap that around it. I can put a long sleeve shirt on and nobody knows that I've got a big clay pack or a poultice here on my arm. With me, I'm actually not allergic to bees, but I do puff up pretty good. So I guess I'm mildly allergic to bees. Wasps don't hardly bother me at all. I can get stung by a wasp and not hardly have any type of a swell. My dad's the other way. He gets stung by a wasp and he kind of puffs up, and I don't really, wasps don't seem to bother me, but bees do. But if I put the clay on within the first 2 or 3 minutes of getting stung, it makes a massive difference. If I wait for an hour and then put it on, it doesn't work near, it still feels nice, but it doesn't work near as well as far as not letting that get big and a big lump like I normally do. Another great way to use it is a clay burrito. So we call these a clay burrito. You can get a piece of cheesecloth and put the clay in it, and then you can use it as an earache. With little kids, you get an earache, and oftentimes it's a clogged duct, an ear duct. And so clay increases local circulation and draws new blood to the area. And so using a clay pack, not only does it feel good because it can be hot or cold, but it also increases local circulation. But then you don't have to have that clay pack making a big mess. I had a friend who, she was born pretty bow-legged, and in her 40s, she got knee surgery on both knees at the same time. And so she had these big sores on her knees, but she also has 3 or 4 little kids at the time. And so what she would do, she made these 2 great big kind of clay burritos, and she'd sit down and she'd be doing laundry and watching TV, and she would just have these clay packs on both knees. And then as soon as she needed to do something, she could just lift those off her knees, go about her day, and then she could just put that clay burrito right back on. And there's enough with a cheesecloth, there's enough that can get through that clay. It seems to work almost just as well, if not as well. So I'm going to show you a few pictures. These are just testimonials or people that have used clay. Kelly is an RN in Park City, and her husband had been using clay for a while, and as an RN, she thought clay was kind of weird. And kind of silly, and there's a lot better ways to do it. But she was home one day, and she touched her arm with the ceramic curling iron, and she didn't have all of the stuff she would normally use in the hospital, and so she begrudgingly went to use her husband's mud, and to her surprise, she wrote us this letter and said, "I burned the underside of my right forearm 3-inch ceramic curling iron. The burn presented as a 2nd-degree partial thickness, the outside slightly blistered, but still blanched and painful. The center would not blanch. Was dry in appearance, no sensation. At this point, I was anticipating infection and scarring. I started applying activated clay covered, activated, she means wet clay, covered by saran wrap for about 20 hours a day. 2 weeks later, stopped applying the clay. The burn healed, some nerve tenderness present, no skin debridement needed to remove the damaged tissue, no infection, no scarring, simply amazing. I could say I'm a believer." And the reason that she mentioned the debridement is normally if you were to go into the hospital, or if she was in the hospital as a nurse working and somebody came in and it looked like this top picture, either of those, they would take a nylon brush because they've got to get rid of that burnt skin. And so they would do what they call debridement, which is one of the worst things as a patient, that's one of the hardest things about having a burn is that debridement. And the reason they do that is because bacteria love freshly burned skin and the rotting skin. So they got to get the rotting skin off, but the bacteria now love freshly burned skin because they're trying to, like you like baby asparagus. So the bacteria start migrating to that wound, and they've got to get that bacteria off as well as the dead skin. And so the clay increases the circulation, it stops the bacteria, and it also pulls off and acts as a mild debridement. So you get all of that without having to do the normal or the non-normal, the current way to do it, which is not how our ancestors would have chosen to do it. And you can just kind of follow it through the healing process there. So this was another guy. Now, one of the things when you get a burn, one of the challenges is our nerves don't like to be exposed. And so if you've ever like really cut your finger good and it's like throbbing, like wow, 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 you put it in your mouth and you take the oxygen off it, it actually stops throbbing. Because the oxygen is off, and then you pull it back out and it starts throbbing again. And burns are the same way. So one of the most painful thing about burns is that it's exposed to the skin. So this is a young guy in his 30s, I think. So he's obviously healthy. You're going to age and heal differently as you age. But so a young guy, fairly healthy, working at a shop, and took a acetylene torch across his forearm, and immediately just third-degree burns and just bad. So he comes to his friend who's using clay, and they put clay on it, just like I showed on that forearm picture. Nice heavy clay pack, and then wrap it with a cloth diaper. Keep it wet. You don't want it to dry on there because it dries, it'll pull tight. And he said, I don't care if this stuff doesn't help at all. At least it doesn't hurt anymore. And time again, when we hear people talking about how they use clay, they could care less if it works, but it takes the pain away. And it's because it's creating a barrier and keeping the oxygen off. That's why it's an anti-inflammatory, because if it hurts and it's throbbing and the skin is just going crazy, you put the clay on there and at least doesn't hurt anymore. Now, he says in 4 days it's back to pink skin. I think that picture is a little, it's pinker than it looks there. This looks, I think the picture makes it look better than it is. And he says it's in 4 days it's back to pink skin. Which, again, he's young, he's healthy, and I'm not saying I don't believe him, but that seems a little more impressive, but there's more pictures to come. So again, this is just a lady on Facebook I found talking about using clay. Used some clay today on a poultice for some pretty painful burns. Got in my hand, I was amazed. Nothing was relieving the pain. Decided to give clay a try. It was instant. Seriously, it was shocking to me how instant it was. After soaking for a few hours, the burns are still tender, but they don't hurt at all. So thankful for clay. And so that's why I say never have kids or grandkids on the property without having some clay handy, because even if it's just an interim until you go get regular care, it can be a great tool in that interim. So this was a young kid. This is the reason you should never put your treadmill next to a wall. So he was running, he fell, and he got pinned between the wall and the treadmill. And even though it was just there for a second, that's all it took to pretty much take all of the skin off his leg. My wife actually did the same thing, and she fell and took the skin off her nose and her cheek and her eye. It wasn't next to the wall, thank goodness, but it was enough to give her a pretty good facial. So he fell, and it was super painful. His mom went and grabbed the clay, didn't know what else to do, but at the moment, let's grab clay, and then we can figure the rest out. First day, put the clay on. You actually can see the dry clay around the edges. This is after the first application. The only discomfort was when we changed the clay once a day. After a week, new skin can be touched without pain. And then 3 months later, you can kind of see the texture of the spot on his leg, but nothing like you would imagine after taking all this top couple layers of skin off your leg. And at that point, there's not much that you can do in a burn unit or in a trauma center because it's just so big. They can't stitch that up. They just got to wait for the skin to grow. And remember, clay increases collagen production, which we know is good. It also increases local circulation, which is good. We know that it kills the bacteria trying to grow, which is good. And when the clay is on, it keeps the oxygen off, which makes it feel really good. And so all of those contribute to to situations like this. This was my forearm. I got into some stinging nettle or something up riding my bike, and I came off the mountain, and as soon as I got done, my forearm was just as puffy and irritated as you can see, and just itched like, you know, no other. So I just grabbed my jar of clay, put that on. You can see the saran wrap here behind it, wrapped it up, and wiped it off 2 hours later, and it went from that to that. In just 2 hours with the clay sitting on it. And before, I was just ready to just tear my arm off completely. So this lady got bit by a spider. Now she's a little bit older, so doesn't have as good of circulation on her foot. Now this is 2 days after the bite, before the first doctor visit. So she took a picture of it. 2 days after, she's thinking, okay, maybe I probably ought to go to the doctor now. Something is not looking right. You can see the red infection here starting to come down from the toe. The blister from the bite is already ruptured. 6 days after the bite, she's still going to the doctor 6 days. So this would be 4 days after doctor care. You can see that now the infection has moved from the center toe to the other 2 toes. You can see the swelling on the pinky toe versus over here, because that infection and poison is still pushing out. So now 8 days in, and now the blisters are moving to the other toes. Again, this is with regular doctor visits. And now we're 11 days after the bite. The blisters have moved to both toes. The infection is clear up in here. And her friend said, my golly, whatever you're doing is not working. Why don't you try clay? And she's like, well, why not at this point? Because nothing they were trying was working. So they started to use clay. So this is 13 days after the bite, the first day of clay. And immediately you can see we've already went from this infection here to almost no infection here, because that clay is just already pulling it out so fast. 3 days after clay, looking way better already. The blisters aren't keeping to move. 6 days after clay, 10 days after the clay, 13, so this is 2 weeks into the clay, and you know the toe is still red, but pretty amazing from the day before using clay to just 2 weeks of using the clay, because it increases collagen fibers, it kills bacteria, it increases local circulation, it's a natural debreeder. So there are, I warned you before, I do have a couple of blood pictures coming up here. So this is a guy from Sugar House area, and he was on a 100-mile bike race, and about 25 mile an hour, he crashed on his bike and filled his leg full of rock and debris and all kinds of stuff. He's an Olympic athlete. He finished the race, because that's what you do, and he gets home and he calls me and he says, Daryl, I have heard that you talk about using clay for road rash. Well, I've got some. What do I do? And I said, well, Mike, you just go to your jar. Hopefully you got it mixed up. He said, nope, I don't. I said, well, grab your jar, mix it up. So the reason you see this picture here is all lumpy clay in the middle versus some of that creamy stuff you saw on my arm is because when you mix clay, it has such a high swell that it takes about 4 hours to fully hydrate. So if you were to take this jar of clay, put it in a mason jar, dump this whole thing in there, dump 2 of those full of water in there, shake it up, and let it sit overnight, it's going to be about 4 hours for that to fully hydrate. Similar to if you were making cookies and you dumped in flour and milk and you get those lumpy balls of flour, and it takes a while to really get all that worked out with the fork. That's like a bazillion times more when it comes to clay. So that's why I always like it to mix up before. But he puts the clay, he mixes it up, he just slaps it on there, and in a couple of hours, the blood was actually on the outside of the clay because it sucks it all the way out and through. And so 2 hours later, he takes a picture, and you can see how much different it looks. Now, he didn't wipe it off with a hose. He just put the clay right on it. Well, his wife gets home and says, Mike, this is stupid. We're going to the ER. And so she takes him to the ER, and they go in and they say, oh my golly, I don't know what you did to clean this, but we could not have done this better with a brush. So you're fine. And he's like, ha ha. And so then he goes home and he used clay one more time as it continued to help heal. This is another example. I'm going to skip that one, but this one here, this is a guy named Anthony from California, and he had skin cancer on his back, and he had the skin cancer removed. So if you look right here, that's sitting about right there. It's about the size of a really large silver dollar, and they had the skin cancer removed, and that hole would not heal. And it just got deeper and more pussy and deeper and more pussy. And so this lady from California calls me. She says, "Hey, Daryl, I've heard that clay works really well. How do I use it? What do I do? Where do I find it?" So we'll find it at a health food store or survival store, mix it up, and just pack it right in that hole. And then every day when he gets out of the shower, whatever falls off, but just put more clay in that hole every time. And she sent me these. So this is the before picture. You can see the infection ring that it's clear out and around on the edges of that picture because it's so inflamed. You can see the gangrene and the pus that's coming out of it. 2 weeks and then 6 weeks. Now that is a pretty good scar because it is having to heal from inside out. But this is from Cindy. This is Anthony's husband, or Anthony's wife. I sent you a first picture August 31st, the second picture September 13th, and the third is November 15th. Look at the difference. Anthony is healing nicely. We can be a testimony for the pain relief. He was, as I said, screaming at the top of his lungs in pain after putting on the clay. Told us within 15 minutes the pain went from a 10 to a 2. By the next day it was a 0. Our doctor says it's now, healing is now complete. The doctor told him, "I don't know, you just got to go home and let this thing run its course," because they could not get it to heal. And then they just did what the Persians, the Romans, the Greeks would all do, and it turned out it worked. This guy is me, actually. And so I was playing with a Cat 5 cable, trying to hook up a computer box under my computer desk. And I used this screwdriver, which I'd also used earlier to lay tile. And so I'd taken the screwdriver, already a regular, and I'd filed it down as I was cleaning the grout between the tile. So that screwdriver's pretty sharp. And I just grabbed it because it was the one that was handy, and I was trying to use it as a pry to pop this edge out of this Cat 5 box in my hand, and it slipped. And I took that screwdriver and punched it clear through, and it was sitting up like this. And I could take the screwdriver and go like that, and it would go like this. And you can see the spot right there. And if you've never had a screwdriver go through your hand, that is pretty painful. I'm sure there's worse pains, but I was able to get the screwdriver out, and it's kind of hard because the muscles grab a hold of it, and it was so painful. And you can see the bruise. It didn't actually break through the back of my hand, but you can see the bruise on the back of my hand where it just about pierced the skin. So I pulled it out, and I just about passed out, and I climbed up the stairs, and I filled my hand full of clay. And just having my hand full of clay, it's crazy how much better that feels, because the pain it's just gone. And then the worst pain is on the back of my hand. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to put clay on the back of my hand. So I did that too. And then I called my brother, who's a pediatrician, and said, "Gary, I just shoved a screwdriver straight through my hand." He said, "I hope it went all the way through." I said, "No, it didn't. It went almost all the way through." He said, "Well, that's a problem, because you probably just embedded a lot of bacteria clear through your hand." He said, "If you would have gone clear through, it could have drained on both sides and you'd probably be okay." So I actually had him call me in a prescription just to be on the safe side, because I didn't know what bacteria was on my screwdriver that I'd shoved through my hand. But as long as the clay was on there, there was really no pain. And as soon as I take that clay off, it would just throb on both sides. And I do have a little scar. Unfortunately, I missed all the tendons, so it could have been a lot worse. But yeah, there's no lasting problems with a screwdriver through your hand. I wouldn't recommend it though. This is my son. He was about 4 years old. He was riding a go-kart in the front yard, and he ran over his finger and filled his finger, kind of road rash. There's a rock. You can kind of see it if you look close, right at that little joint right there. And then he's got another rock right down in here. And he came in, he was going into shock, and my wife's probably starting to go into shock. And so fortunately, I had the tube of clay like that pre-mixed up. I grabbed a food service glove from under our kitchen sink that we used to chop the jalapenos and whatever. And I filled the finger just clear full of clay. And then I put his little hand in there. And once the clay bag was on like that, within a minute or two, he quit crying. And just sat there and fell asleep. And then we would just change the clay every time every morning or every night when the clay started to either slip out of the bag or he was. But as an active little boy, as long as he had his hand in a glove, he would play like there was no other problem. Just went about his life and just kept the glove on. Now the first day, you can see that rock even better, right there. A pretty good sized rock. And I thought, well, if this doesn't come out on this next change, I'm going to either get my tools out and dig it out, or we'll take him in and have the doctor look at it. Because I was running with the EMTs at the time. But I thought if I take him in, the flesh at the tip of the finger is so gone, there's nothing they are going to be able to do. Because they can't, so there's nothing there. And then the rock, I thought, well, if clay works like I know it can, I'll just keep putting clay on and see if that rock doesn't come out on its own. Sure enough, it did. By day 4, the rock's gone, and the clay just sucked it right out. Day 5, and then 2 weeks later. And now if you look at his hand, he's 20 now. He's got a little texture. You can see where he kind of hurt his hand, kind of like maybe where I've got mine on my palm. But no debridement, no extra trauma, and no pain from the other type of treatments that would have been used. Okay, this is one of the nastiest ones. This is a Amish farmer, and this guy called my dad one day because he's also into clay and clay therapies, and said, "Hey, Neil, I stepped over a PTO on my tractor and I tore a big hole in my leg, and I'm using clay on it. I wonder if I can just keep using clay." My dad says, "Oh yeah, you can use clay. You know, clay works great for trauma cases. You know, just why don't you send me a picture?" And so the guy sent this picture, and my dad's like, "Wait a second, you should not be using clay. This is like not use it for a little skin thing, not like your leg is missing half of its leg." And he said, "Nope, all I'm doing is clay, and as long as I take a couple Tylenol and pack clay in it, I'm fine." And my dad's like, "You really shouldn't." So this is one of the craziest ones that we have seen. Now, compared to some of the crazy stuff we see in the war pictures and from the war studies I showed you before, it's not that crazy. But when you have other options, there was probably a lot of other ways this gentleman could have taken care of this that probably was better. But all he did was clay. And so he's using clay and taking Tylenol. And he sent this picture 10 days in, which obviously is looking better, but we're thinking, okay, there's a big skin flap there that's probably got to be trimmed or cut out. But nope, he just keeps putting clay on it. So this is 17 days, looking better and better, but still that skin flap. This is 24 days in. Now we're 31 days in, and that flap is actually pulling in, interestingly enough. 40 days, 45 days, 60 days, 63 days, and that's a year later. And all he did was clay and Tylenol, which I wouldn't recommend, but you can see if you're in a situation where all you have is clay and you can't get to medical immediately, it's a great way to keep things, because the reason the military uses it, it's a great blood stop, which wasn't a problem in this case, but maybe initially, but it increases skin production, collagen fibers, it pulls out the bacteria so you don't have to go through that debridement or some of those other treatments that actually kill more skin cells as they're also healing, which is one of the reasons sometimes that takes longer with some more traditional methods. So this is the x-ray of a tiller tine that went in one side and out the other. And then this is what the hole looked like. So this is the entrance hole and the exit hole. And so this is day 1 after 7 days of just packing clay in there. You can see again on this picture on the left, the dry clay around the wound, because that's all he's using is clay. This is another Amish fellow. 7 days in, so that picture is the same as this picture, and that picture is the same as this picture. So 7 days in, both of those, the entry hole and the exit hole, are getting smaller and smaller. Day 15 and day 23. So about 5 weeks and then about 4 months for the same entry and the exit hole. So clay uses and considerations. We'll just end with this. So the nice thing with clay is there's no contraindications. You can't go wrong. The challenge with clay is it's very different. And so in those studies on clay that they did with NASA and they've done with other, like Dr. Williams, getting the same clay to react the same way is very different every time because it's so natural. And so there are some variations and some deposit inconsistencies even within a deposit that we, in southern Utah, we have this clay deposit. And even within that deposit, there's some natural variation. Some has a little higher pH, some has a lower pH. And so I always tell people, don't give up on clay, find a different source. And if you've got a great clay, we're here in Utah, we have some great clay, but if you were in South America or in Europe, there's other great clay deposits out there. And so what you're really looking for is a clay that has a high pH, has a high cation exchange capacity, especially if you're going to take it internally. Some that has a high surface area to surface tension ratio, and then that it's been handled cleanly. You don't want to get clay if it's right next to the refinery or something like that. But generally speaking, there's great clay all over the world. There are often other medical treatments that are available that may be even better than clay. I say all the time, I'm not anti-medicine, I'm not anti-doctor, but there's a lot of times where clay, even if you end up using other options later, like in my son's case, it was just so nice to immediately put clay on it, and his trauma and his pain went away immediately. Even if we ended up taking him then to the doctor and he, got his hand sewed up or something, at least that initial trauma can be aided. Clay can be messy and can be inconvenient. Ways you can mitigate that, you can use a piece of saran wrap to cover it, like I showed you there. You can use a clay burrito. You can use clay powders. So, in the diaper rash case, you can use it wet or you can use it dry. Clay is also great for dry shampoo, so you can use it for a dry shampoo as well. So the real advantages of using clay, again and again and again, the main thing we hear is reduction in pain. As I showed in some of those things. It also can be great for reducing infection, especially if you've got treatment that's a long way away. And this is kind of more of a survival class discussion. And in the absence of medical care, if something were to really go wrong, or you get out of Dodge bag and you've got to take off somewhere, having clay with you can make a massive difference for you and your family, because maybe you don't barter with it, but for something that you can use everything from food poisoning and dysentery to a very traumatic injury from, stepping over a PTO or a tiller tine or, road rash, whatever that is, it can be used a lot. And the nice thing, it can be used in conjunction with other things. Some medicine, you have a lot of these contraindications where if you use this solution, you can't use all these other ones, and the way things interact. With clay, you don't ever have to worry about that because it just works. So that is the overview on clay. My dad does another class on clay. Maybe some of you have attended that one. He has a little book called We Eat Clay and Wear It Too. And he talks about how to mix clay and how to use clay in that little class. And I know you guys carry clay. Here's one of the jars that's in the store. There's also a 6-pound version of it that's a little easier on the wallet for bigger volume. This jar will make a quart of mud. I like a wide mouth jar. A wide mouth mason jar is the easiest way that I've found. And this, what is this, about $10, $14, $11? Somewhere in that range?
I don't remember.
I think it's somewhere in the $10, $11 range. But this will make a quart, 1 quart of mud. And so it'll swell about 3 times. So anyway, thank you for letting me come. Hopefully there were
We
some
got
things
questions.
Yes, I'm fine to stay for questions.
Okay, I got one, and then I'll. Okay, so I had a nurse or two, RNs, that were very concerned about using clay on 3rd-degree burns that had gone down all the way down to the bone.
Yep.
I know you are not a doctor, but have you, in your studies, have you found that the clay has been helpful in a 3rd-degree burn situation when we may not have access to doctors?
So yes, and yes. So in a 3rd degree, there are books that talk about it working all the way through, just like some of these big trauma cases. However, if it were me, I would probably do the plan B approach where if I'm in the middle of nowhere, I would use clay in the interim and then I would still get to the clinic. One of the challenges with burns, especially a big burn like that, is maintaining your body temperature. And so even if you're treating the burn itself, the body temperature, the body has a real tough time regulating its temperature in a burn. And so when you go to a burn unit, one of the things that the nurses and the doctors are doing is trying to help your body maintain its temperature when you have such a serious burn like that. So I wouldn't just do clay in something like that. To be honest with you, there are quite a few pictures here that I wouldn't just do clay either. But I think clay is a great interim item in the toolbox. So I wouldn't rely on it completely, but I certainly would use it in the interim.
My question is do they use clay in the burn units for electrical burns and all your burns, frostbite burns?
Most clinics, no, not in the US, most don't. There are, so in Amish country, in Pennsylvania and greater Ohio, where they're a little more leery of Western medicine and leery of government getting too involved in their lives. There are times in Amish culture where people will get burned. They use a treatment called burdock leaves, and they'll use these leaves to help treat the burns. And what they find is the hospitals there have found that if they will work with the Amish practitioners, that they actually get a lot better outcomes. And so they do this. So they're actually one of the best places in Pennsylvania that they'll actually use natural medicine with Western medicine without trying to compete with each other. And so I actually was invited to go speak at a University of Pittsburgh Medical Center on how and why clay is used so well in Amish communities and why and how to use it in the hospital in conjunction with burdock treatment and Western medicine. So there are some, but not a lot. The challenge is clay isn't technically sterile because it's dirt, and there's everything in Western medicine says don't put dirt in a wound, or don't use dirt for a burn. And so because of that, many are hesitant to use it, even though we've got a lot of studies. So my dad and I actually send studies to researchers and to hospitals, usually when they say, hey, we've got these patients that are using these leaves and this clay and we're seeing great results. Can you tell me what it is and more about it? And then we'll send them some of these studies. So not as many as we'd like, but there are some. It's a long answer.
Online question. Does the clay contain parasites? Also, can it remove parasites? Please discuss parasites in general, and also same questions with heavy metals.
So the easy one first is heavy metals, and that's absolutely. There is stacks of research, this high on cadmium, mercury, and lead, and clay removing that. Not in humans, because all the studies are in animal studies, and so there's tilapia and birds and pigs and fish and fowl, but there's no human studies on that. But it's used as a natural chelator, not in the US, but in other countries for that very reason. Now parasites, unless something contaminated the clay, there wouldn't be any parasites in the clay itself. There are researchers that show that clay, just like it binds to E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, and some of the studies on the antibacterial natures of clay, they say it works the same way with parasites. I have not seen a parasite study. So the books on clay say yes. Anecdotally, they say yes. I have a tough time saying, my dad would say yes. I have a tough time saying yes because I haven't seen the white paper on it. My answer is I don't know, but most people would say yes. But I say I don't know.
Okay, so how fast would they see results with their heavy metal detox, like the animals, when you were seeing all those studies?
In those studies, it would see within a week to 2 weeks is when they start seeing those log reductions. And so it probably starts working immediately, but it's usually those studies are like 1 week, 2 week, 3 week studies when they find those results.
Those animals that have lead poisoning and stuff, but they get better within a few weeks.
Correct. Yep. Those lead levels will start dropping. Lead, cadmium, and mercury are the studies we have.
Okay, next one online. Can the clay be reused or rehydrated, or does it take on the impurities it comes in contact with?
So, two schools of thought there. Is yes, you could reuse it. However, when I've used clay, it does. If I were using it for like that rash picture that I showed, I don't see anything in the clay that would look bad. And so you could dry that out, crush it up, and potentially use it again. When you're using it for trauma cases, you have dead skin, you have pus, you have all kinds of nasty stuff in it. And the clay is really cheap. So unless you were in a real situation where you had zero access to new clay, I would almost always get new clay. I just don't see a reason not to. Knowing how much clay draws into it, to me that you could reuse your toothpaste, but I probably would start with fresh.
Okay, how do you remove the clay from a burn or serious wound?
Ooh, great question. So I just use irrigation. So one of the things with clay, because it feels so good, you wouldn't on a burn. If you're scraping that clay off, you're doing just that same that the debridement would be in the hospital, which doesn't feel very good, and the clay does itself. So if you look at these pictures that we had, almost all of those have clay stuck in and around the wound. And so what we'll do at our house is if I have like my little boy's hand, when he had all those things, I would just take that food service glove and slide it off, and whatever clay comes off with the glove comes off, and then I would just run water over it, and whatever water just gently rubs it, then the whatever clay comes off, and then I would just pack new clay on top of it. Nothing in the literature would suggest that leaving clay, if there's like that guy Anthony with his back, there's nothing to suggest that you have to get all the clay out of that hole before you put new clay on it. And so his wife would just irrigate it in the shower, not scrub it out, not irritate it anymore. And whatever clay came off would come off, and she'd just put the new clay right on top of the old clay that would still stick.
Okay, another one. How effective is it with warts?
The books would say quite. I have never had the patience. And so I have used it for like plantar warts. I had a wart on my finger, and it's just too busy. And so maybe if I kept it on long enough, maybe it would. It's kind of like how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? 3, because after 3 you just bite it. And so I've never been patient enough. So personally what I do, and what I've done with my kids when they've gotten like warts on their fingers or their toes when they've been little, is you can buy a can. It's called Easy Off. It's actually, mechanics use it to, it's basically like compressed frozen air. And you use it to get a bolt off, and you can spray the bolt with this. It's almost like you'd go to the hospital and they'd use that freeze liquid nitrogen. And it's a can that you buy at the hardware store. And it's got a little straw in it like a can of WD-40. And you can just spray it right on the wart, and it'll just freeze it just like the doctor would do. And then I'll use clay to help it heal after I freeze it off myself. So I use it that way because I've never had the patience. There are books, some of those books talk about how they've used it for warts, and they wrap it every day for 3 months, and sure enough it works. But I don't have that kind of patience. So I've tried the duct tape thing. I've tried a few different things, black salve, but I like the bolt remover.
Okay, so somebody asked also, diatomaceous earth. How is that? Is that the same thing, or is it different?
Great question. And that's an interesting one with the parasites, because a lot of people will use D. It's called diatomaceous earth, or DE. Diatomaceous earth, if you don't know, is basically ancient seashells that have been crushed up super fine. And so if you look at DE, or diatomaceous earth, under a microscope, It looks almost like razor blades. It's that sharp. And so DE is used as a natural pesticide. You can dust your strawberries with it. You can dust your squash plants, and it'll actually cut you can dust your tomato plants, and it actually cuts the worms and the bugs that are trying to eat your plants. It's pretty cool stuff. And so for internal parasites, a lot of people will use diatomaceous earth, and there's some good research on it. I don't have the research on diatomaceous earth. It is quite different because of the clay is a very soft, flat particle platelet, and diatomaceous earth is a very sharp seashell structure that slices versus absorbs. And so the clay would work against parasites by absorbing it and suffocating it, where diatomaceous earth would actually physically change that parasite.
Okay. Someone's asking sprained ankles. So how does it work on sprains or swelling?
Yeah, so great question. I have in my other presentation, I've got a picture of my little brother. He actually was playing shortstop, and the guy in the outfield caught the ball, turned to throw it to home, and just threw it full on straight right into his face, and just crushed his cheek. And so he went to the hospital, and they took some steel rods and pushed up through the nose to reopen the nasal cavity. And he had to go in and have his face kind of rebuilt. But to do that, you have to have the swelling go down. And so he packed his face in clay and went back the next day, because they said every day you need to come back in here so we can kind of make sure your nasal cavity is reopened. And just by packing the clay, it removed the swelling fast enough that they did the surgery the next day versus having to wait several days for the swelling to go down. I crushed my nose in high school in wrestling. And so I had to wear that wrestling funny alien looking mask in wrestling season. And at the state tournament, I would, because this was the day before state, I crushed it in practice. And so I went to state, and I would sit there in the stands with a clay burrito across my face. And it would pull, it makes your eyes a lot less black because it actually increases circulation. But as long as I had the clay pack on my nose, I could breathe because it would help increase that local circulation. I'd take it off to wrestle, put the face mask on, I would wrestle, and by the time I got off, I could hardly breathe again because of the swelling, and then I could just put that clay burrito back on, and because it increases local circulation, that's typically what swelling is caused by. So on a sprain, we have a lot of stories that it works really well, because what you typically have is coagulated fluid that's rushing to the area, and depending on the age, as we age, we get less circulation down in our lower extremities. And so if you sprain your ankle and it's big and swollen and all that blood and fluid are rushing to the area, by packing the ankle in clay, that clay increases local circulation, it helps reduce inflammation, and so the swelling goes down a lot faster. So it doesn't necessarily heal it, although it does help remove all of that excess fluid, which allows it to get better faster. But it doesn't heal the sprain. It's not fixing a tendon, but it can reduce the inflammation like you would with the typical heat and cold therapy.
Next question is colloidal silver. What if you imbued the clay with colloidal silver?
Even better. So the picture that I showed you, the only picture that I didn't give you the full story, is Anthony, that guy with the skin cancer. So when they called me, that's what they did, is instead of mixing clay with water, they mixed the clay that they used on that open skin cancer hole with colloidal silver. So would it work as well? We don't know, because they didn't have two holes. But the nice thing about colloidal silver is we do know that is very antibacterial. Clay works against bacteria. Colloidal silver is in fact antibacterial. And so by putting those two together, you're attacking the bacteria two ways. And so I actually have my own colloidal silver generator, and so I make my own. It's pretty inexpensive. I make sure I do it right. I wear gloves. I make sure I'm really careful so I don't get proteins and salts in there, because that can be a problem with colloidal silver. But if you use colloidal silver with clay, you would certainly amplify the antibacterial nature of the clay. It's pretty expensive if you're buying it and you don't have the technology to do it yourself. Colloidal silver is very expensive. In the case of Anthony, where he's only using it for this little spot on a very, very, very infected, inflamed, that's when I would pull it out. I've done that at my house. But like if I was the lady with the toe that looked so rough, I would use clay and colloidal. She didn't, she just used clay. But maybe if she had used clay mixed with colloidal silver, it would have been even faster. When there are, in my opinion, if there's a lot of pus and infection and inflammation, that would be a time where it might be worth spending a little extra money and doing it with silver and not just with water.
What ratio would you use the colloidal silver and clay?
So the question was, what ratio would you use the clay with the colloidal silver? If it were me, because I have abundance of both, I would just mix the whole thing with colloidal silver instead of using water. Yeah, I would just do 2 to 1 at a lot smaller amount. So use a tablespoon of powder and then use 2 tablespoons of silver to make and I would use that as kind of like the nuclear option versus, I would certainly not use that on a sprain. I wouldn't use it on a rash. I wouldn't use it because it just doesn't, even my little boy's finger, there was no infection there. Probably, I mean, it worked fine without it. But if it was an older wound or there was infection, like on Anthony, or the foot or things like that, or that one on the back of the leg that I kind of skipped over. I mean, we could look at a lot of pictures, but without if there's not the infection and the bacteria and all of that other nasty pus stuff, I would probably start with just the clay. But if there's any sign of infection or old wounds, I wouldn't hesitate at all, because you're just going to get that extra antibiotic nature, almost like a neosporin version of clay on steroids.
I hear you can brush your teeth with it.
Yeah, so maybe because I was cheap, my dad was cheap, or he was a genius. Growing up, we brush our teeth with salt and clay powder. And our ancestors would have used salt a lot. In fact, if you ever go to the dentist and they pull a tooth out, they'll tell you to gargle with some salt water, because salt's one of the most healing things in the world. Salt is just, pretty cool stuff. And the idea of putting salt in a wound, you've heard that saying, that actually comes from putting salt in battlefield wounds because it helps it heal faster. It does sting, but it does help heal things faster because of that nature. So with the mouth, we could have a full little side discussion on oral care, but the short version is, in our mouths, we have something called Staphylococcus mutans. These Staphylococcus mutans are the bacteria that digest the sugars in our mouth. And so these little bacteria, they eat sugar and they excrete lactic acid. So when, growing up, my mom used to say, hey, don't eat sugar, your sugar's going to destroy your teeth. That's not true. She lied. Because you can take your teeth out and put them in a glass of sugar water and your teeth would be just fine. What happens is, though, our teeth are made of enamel. The enamel can withstand, remember in chemistry we have the pH scale, and you have 14 is super alkaline, 0 is acidic, and 7 is neutral. Our teeth are primarily made of something called calcium phosphate. Not made of fluoride, our teeth are made of calcium phosphate. Our calcium phosphate enamel can withstand a pH of 5. Can I use this whiteboard? It might make more sense if I draw a picture. So our enamel can withstand a pH of 5.5. So what happens is, so on a pH scale, so we have 14, we have 0, we have 7, and then right here we have 5.5. So 7 is pH neutral, and so this is pH on this scale, and this scale is going to be time. 0, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120 minutes. So when we wake up in the morning, our mouth is probably a pH of about 7. Because overnight our mouths like homeostasis. So we get up in the morning and we think, man, a big glass of orange juice sounds amazing. Well, orange juice has a pH of about 3. So our mouth is here, and we're going to have this big glass of orange juice, and boom, all of a sudden we're down here at 3. Now the body knows that's not good, and so the body's going to start pulling minerals out of our saliva and out of our bones, essentially, eventually, to pull and to neutralize that acidity in our mouth. Otherwise, your teeth would eventually just fall out of your head, because here at 5.5, is how strong your teeth are naturally. So at about 30 minutes, you come back up here on your mouth. So anytime you're here, you're losing enamel. You can think of enamel as boxes. And this box that's making up our enamel, these little boxes, have something in them called calcium phosphate. And when the calcium phosphate is exposed to a pH of below 5.5, the calcium phosphate is pulled out of the tooth. Now, fortunately, we have minerals in the saliva that replaces that calcium phosphate. So as long as that demineralization and remineralization is happening throughout the day, your teeth are fine. The problem is if you go through a period of time and you don't replace those, then eventually you start wearing away that enamel. Now, if you look at a tooth, I'm not a very good tooth drawer. We have a tooth, and we have these little biofilms called Staphylococcus, well, the little bacteria, and these Staphylococcus mutans, they form together a little colony called a biofilm, and they set up shop back there on that molar. It's hard to reach. And every day you're eating some food, the bacteria eat the food, and they excrete lactic acid in this one little spot. And so it gets a little acid erosion. They do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. And eventually they're going to make a cavity, or they're going to bury a hole all the way down through that through the enamel. And then here we have these dentine tubes. These dentine tubes are filled with kind of a fluid, and then your nerves are down here. So enamel has no sensation. Your dentine tubes, though, transfer heat and cold really well. So as soon as you get that cavity that's formed all the way down there and start hitting that dentine, that cold air, that cold water, whatever it is, hits that dentine tubular, whew, that hurts really bad. So in dentistry, what we're going to do is we're going to brush the teeth to mechanically brush. So this is a long story to get where you were asking. So in a toothpaste, we want something that is a mild abrasion, because we want something that's going to take away that biofilm that's building up on our teeth. You could use a stick. We use toothbrushes mostly. And so clay, so we want a mild abrasion, and then we want something to boost the pH. So a lot of toothpaste will have baking soda in it, because if your pH is here and you brush your teeth with some Arm & Hammer baking soda toothpaste or some clay, which has a pH of 10, whoosh, you're like there. So instead of doing that all day long, because then you're going to eat lunch, then you're going to eat dinner, and then we're going to have a midnight snack. So it's going to go like that. So as long as we're doing that, then every day our teeth are getting demineralized and remineralized. So somebody might say, well, what about fluoride? I've heard fluoride's really good. Well, that's actually interesting, because fluoride has a so if you have calcium phosphate in that tooth, which is what nature normally does, you can withstand pH of 5.5. Now, fluoride looks a whole lot like calcium phosphate, and so the body is really happy to put a fluoride in that box as well. If a fluoride is in that box, in addition to calcium phosphate, your teeth can withstand 4.6 instead of 5.5. So when a dentist says, hey, fluoride strengthens your teeth, they're right. Fluoride is also a neurotoxin, and it's also other problems causing brittle bones and stuff like that. And so it's a trade-off. But when they say there's this big controversy around fluoride, right? Probably many of you have been in that discussion. And fluoride does absolutely strengthen teeth. And what's interesting is pH is logarithmic, meaning a difference of 1 isn't 1. It's actually much higher than 1, because it's like this. So one change in pH is a 30 times difference in the amount of calcium phosphate loss. So if you are bathing your teeth in acid a lot, you'd actually be, there is an argument to be made to put fluoride in your structure, not in water, but in toothpaste, because actually it does strengthen enamel. Now you can go to the catacombs of Europe and you can go to Egypt and you can have these beautiful mummified teeth that have no, way before we ever had fluoride toothpaste or fluoride water, and they're great teeth. But it's because they weren't doing this bathing of acid all day long. So one of the challenges is we might kind of make fun of, sometimes in the US, we make fun of England for their bad teeth, right? But in England, they drink a lot of tea, and tea is acidic. And you could drink 4 gallons of tea first thing in the morning, brush your teeth, and you're fine. The problem is, if you were to look at this chart, keeping in mind that this is normal enamel and 4.6 is fluorided enamel. And now we're going to get up and have a glass of tea, and then let's have another sip. Let's have another sip. Let's have another sip. And then all day long, your teeth are bathed in acid. The same thing if you're sucking on a lemon. Sometimes little kids, one of the real challenges if you have little kids are sippy cups. That's one of the worst things in the world for teeth. Because what happens if you have a sippy cup full of milk, milk's great for you, but milk's also clear full of sugar. So every time you take a sip of milk, all the bacteria in the mouth are like, whoo, and they're eating they're eating the sugar, they're excreting lactic acid, and so sippy cups are why a kid that has a sippy cup all day long, they're probably going to have teeth problems, because their cavities are going to be much higher than if they were to just have a glass of milk and not suck on sugar or soda or tea or coffee or energy drinks, because of this scale. Now, when it comes to great things in dentistry, we want something as a mild abrasive, and then we also want something with a high pH, and then we want something that's clean, that they're cleansing. And so clay is a great toothpaste. And so you can make yourself, whether you use 90% clay and 10% salt powder, you can make it, dip it in there, put a drop of peppermint essential oil so your breath smells fresh. If you want to mix it up and hydrate it first and then use a little jar, you can make your own toothpaste with it. And it works just fine. So there's a brand called Earth Paste that you may have seen. Earth Paste is clay, salt, water, and essential oil. And that's, or you can make your own for pennies on the dollar.
Any other questions? Oh my
Thanks
gosh.
for letting me come. Love to come back. We could do a whole one on natural dentistry too sometime. That was maybe a longer side discussion than you wanted.
Oh, you're awesome. We so appreciate you coming.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. So everybody give them a round. Thank you. Thanks everybody online. Bye. Now I sing la la la. We already had that discussion earlier. There's a concert. Okay.